And now for part 3. To explore the outer limits of what could be measured within our reality with the use of secondary dimensions, and to discover everything that we can measure within our small portion of everything, I painstakingly counted the number of secondary dimensions with the assumption that I accurately deduced the number of primary dimensions. If this is the first video of mine on dimensionalism you are watching, I recommend that you start watching the dimensionalism playlist from the beginning, as important disclosures are given in the first video to be forthright about my ingenuity, and also the logic of the previous videos are built upon here and in later parts, so continue viewing at your own discretion. But the TLDW is that I am not a physicist nor a mathematician, but because I value the scientific method and have been properly educated to use it with my bachelor's degree in psychology, I would hope that you would bear with me and wait until my superiors in physics to validate any of what I say before accepting it as peer-reviewed knowledge. So take what I say here with a skeptical grain of salt, and as always, think for yourself. So in the last episode, I ended with showing the Stefan Boltzmann constant's final dimensions extending beyond what should be directly verifiable. So I pondered, could imaginary dimensions actually be useful in explaining phenomena in our reality? I rationalized that tertiary/imaginary dimensions could be useful because that is the best way I can explain what is going on with the Stefan Boltzmann constant at the moment. Another possibility is that my calculated secondary dimensional representation for temperature being derived from the average amount of kinetic energy divided by the particles of a substance is off in some way, and temperature is somehow actually not an expression of energy and is in itself another primary dimension. But considering that thermal energy and solar power are often used to describe temperature, we can be sure that temperature is not primary, even though they're another form of secondary dimensional representation is possible. Some commonly used secondary dimensions include energy, volts, watts, pressure, and force. They are secondary because they use more than one of the 4 primary dimensions. And the last one that I mentioned, force, is very important to physicists because 4 forces are considered as fundamental to the elementary building blocks of our reality. These 4 forces are currently gravity, electromagnetic force, and the strong and weak nuclear forces. And unifying these 4 forces is essentially what makes a grand unified theory of everything in physics. So with this information in mind, I would ask you guys this question. How can there be any fundamental forces when the concept of force isn't even fundamental, but rather a secondary manifestation of the primary dimensions? The answer is that the term fundamental in this case is used to describe interactions that occur at the atomic level. Forces that happen between the standard model of elementary particles, and we will go over this in greater detail in part 4. We will now count the currently assumed number of secondary dimensions that could be used to measure things in our reality using the 10 primary dimensions. And here's how I did it. Using the assumed dimensional quantity observed in reality for the logically deduced number of primary dimensions, with mass having 1, electric current having 2, length having no more than 3, and time not having any more than 4. I counted the different combinations possible at every variable number. Now, I did leave Q out of this process because technically Q, or quantitative measurements, is always in the equation, and it is assumed to be 1 unless otherwise specified. The quantitative measurements are essentially the differentiations in both the primary and the secondary dimensions that we observe, so putting Q here would be redundant, as the change in the value of Q is exactly what we should be calculating when measuring reality, with 1 meter of length being distinct from 1 second in time, being distinct from 1 meter second of displacement, being distinct from 1 meter per second of speed, being distinct from 1 second per 1 meter of pace, time distance? I don't know what to call that one. How do I explain this rarely used phenomena of 1 second per 1 meter? The best way I can think of is using the end of this, or different points on this second hand on the analog clock as like the amount of seconds it takes for the end of this point to reach 1 full meter will probably be about 60 seconds per meter. And points closer to the center of the point would actually, it would take longer for that point to go that long in a second. Hope that makes sense. Plus, that thing is just the reciprocal of speed anyway, so it doesn't really have many realistic uses in the real world, but it can be measured. So anyways, to calculate every dimensional measurement we could use to measure our surroundings, the 10 primary dimensions should be counted here too as a single variable expression of all the different types of expressions we could use. One-dimensional expressions are given as follows: m, e, e squared, l, l squared, l to the third, t, t squared, t to the third, t to the fourth. So that amount would give us 10 base single variables, which we determined in the previous video. This 10 will double to 20 at the very end to take into consideration the reciprocals of, well, q over all of the 10 base dimensions. In the universe we see around us, we can measure mass fine, we can measure electric current fine, and we can measure volumetric space fine. But could we directly measure something in seconds to the fourth, or even the third or the second? I mean, we can conceptually do it, and its existence can be measured in other phenomena, but we can only really see one time dimension, or two if we are being really clever in our experiments, like with the double slit experiment or with the quantum eraser experiment. So should we discount the primary counting of the third and fourth time dimensions and acknowledge that moment by moment our observations are limited to an 8-dimensional plane of existence? It's subjective. If you want to get super technical about it, which you are more than welcome to, a person could research the relationship of exactly how many of the time dimensions can be observed when using directly observable secondary dimensions, and discount the time dimensions that are higher than what could be seen. Kudos to you if you decide to do that. But as for me, I am just building a foundation of only the rationally deducible possible variations of what can be measured that can be better built upon and chipped away by scientists of the future. So even though we could technically chip away 2 of the primary dimensions as dimensions we cannot directly observe, they will remain here as a standard building block from which secondary dimensions could and have been measured. Now a new rule for counting the secondary dimensional expressions comes up. We cannot be combining 2 of the same kind of dimensional type. For example, we cannot combine L2 and L3 to measure something new, because multiplying them together would just give us L5, and that's a possibility we've already eliminated in the last episode. And dividing them in any way, L3 over L2 would give us some variation of either Q over L or L over Q, and L already has that covered. So I made this table a little bit better. There are different numbers of variables that you can have combining those 10 base variable expressions. So there are 10 different combinations of a single variable with only one way to really do that, with a total of 10 possible one single base variable combinations. And at the very end, we will do a times 2 to all of these totals to take into consideration all of the reciprocals. So 2 variable expressions can be expressed in 35 different combinations in 2 different ways. So for example, combining m and e can either give you m times e or m over e. And the reciprocals would be q over me or e over m, which we will count at the very end. With the amount of double variable combinations amounting to 35 expressed in their 2 different ways will give us 70 double variable expressions. 3 variable expressions can be expressed in 50 different combinations in 4 different ways. And if you want to see all of the mathematical process that I took to get to this point, I will post the final edition of my Intro to Dimensionalism paper in the final video of this series. These 50 triple variable combinations expressed in their 4 different ways would give us 200 base triple variable expressions. The foreign ultimate variable expressions can be expressed in only 24 different combinations in 8 different ways, though. These 24 quadruple variable expressions expressed in their 8 different ways can give us 192 quadruple variable expressions. So we just add these totals together, 110 plus 70 plus 200 plus 192, and multiply the whole set by 2, which gives us a total number of expressions that we can use to measure things within our reality. 944. Ta-da! Could there be more? Sure. If other primary dimensions could be shown to exist. And while I was in the process of making this paper, I for a long time thought that the mole had made the cut to be an additional primary dimension, thinking the mole had only one unique iteration like mass does, and having the total number of dimensions being equal to 11. I cannot tell you how big of a mother ducker my brain went through after I realized I had to, because I had already done all of the math for this part 3 with 11 dimensions, and I had to redo it all from scratch. So if another time dimension could be rationally provided to allow free movement along the time dimension of variable physics, this 944 number could go up, but not as much as adding an entirely new dimension type, which honestly would be just as groundbreaking. And yet even another possibility that I've already hinted at is that some tertiary and imaginary dimensions may be used to directly measure phenomena in our reality. I don't know these limits, but the scientific process will one day fill us in on what these limits are. That is, if our descendants are able to live long enough to discover those limits. Could there be other new types of dimensions? Sure. I would even bet that there is, because everything would not be a very good everything if there wasn't. But that universe isn't directly observable to our reality, nor directly verifiable. For now, we will just chalk that one up to be calculated within the imaginary everything. Is it possible that the second electric current dimension and the fourth time dimension actually represent the same dimension? Sure, but I doubt it. Even when we account for the fact that we cannot measure charge without time, the candela, which is calculated without the column, still maintains the 4-time dimension hypothesis. The names of the 2 dimensions of the electric current field could be named as they have been, the electric field and the magnetic field. To finish off this section, I say that if you cannot deduce the dimensions using your field of study, at least indirectly for more subjective fields like psychology, you cannot in the same breath be certain that your field of study is a valid science, probably because it is in fact an imaginary science. So before ending this video, one last thing on imaginary science. If you were to claim that an all-powerful God made the universe and currently has the power to causally change the outcome of a situation from undesirable situation A to more desirable situation B, there needs to be some falsifiable test that shows that the outcomes change significantly more than random chance and the placebo effect in the quantum omniverse, and significantly more than the changes claimed to be caused by another God. If the test fails, any claims of knowledge given by people on behalf of said God can be dismissed as an imaginary science, as their God has failed to meet the significant standard of accepting knowledge, and thus failing to meet the burden of proof of the God's existence in the first place. The living, breathing essence of this channel, Death of a Notion, is to debunk ideas that go against observed truths of reality. Religions do that a lot. Political movements do that a lot when they are being led by the unthinking elite. And things of taboo tend to do that a lot, because whenever things are taboo, people are less likely to speak up about it and less likely to be informed properly on the taboo topic. And if they are never properly informed on the taboo topics, that just leaves them to believe ridiculous things about the things of taboo. Dimensionalism, I do hope, can stand up to being an acceptable representation of a null hypothesis for the reality around us, not giving any more or any less than what has been learned or observed by myself. I may not know everything. My observations may be limited to 5 senses within the span of a singular entity's lifetime. My entity. There's the humble possibility that everything I have learned and observed is wrong. But together, our collective observations and our collective knowledge, and being open to change our individual minds in the face of differing evidence, is a core aspect of dimensionalism. Well, if you be liking the kind of stuffs I've been doing, please exercise the act of doing me a giddy and clicking on those like and subscribe buttons. So until next time, mother duckers, kumbaya, be cordial, learn, and if you don't, I'll have to change my outro saying to yippee-ki-yay, mother duckers. I'm sorry, I can't even say that with a straight face. Kumbaya, mother duckers.